All right. So thank you for joining us today. And
Thank you.
we usually like to start out with a first question about the first steps of your professional journey. So if you could tell everyone kind of how you first started and also how you determined where the first place you wanted to go was, would be great.
Happy to. Thank you for having me on this discussion, and excited to be discussing this with the students. For me, it was relatively simple because I also had an additional constraint where I needed to work towards a green card. So it's a larger entity that I had to join and start with. I started with Oracle, my professional journey. I made a big switch from mechanical engineering to computer science because at that point, computer science was at the beginning of a hockey stick. I didn't deeply understand it in as much depth, but at the same time I could feel it instinctively that certain things are at the beginning of a hockey stick, some things are at the end of a hockey stick. And tides will raise all ships. So if you're in the beginning,
not a bad place to be.
It's not a bad place to be at all. So when you're in one of those situations, because the entire industry is growing, oftentimes when you're 80% ready, people show up and say, Brett, you're 80% ready, but I don't have a manager to turn to. You are manager from tomorrow. You'll be 85% correct day after, and 90 eventually. You'll be 100% in 3 months. It's a lot quicker to grow that way. Versus an industry where there's pressure and they're shrinking, then even if you're 120% ready, we have to nitpick and tell you, Brett, you're missing 3 more things and 5 more things. And it's increasingly harder because you're not missing anything for this level, but the next level or the level beyond. But that's not the core problem. The core problem is the industry isn't at the beginning of the hockey stick. So I was fortunate.
Now that's really interesting. How did you kind of develop that intuitive sense around that? Because obviously that's something that's very probably helped you.
It helped me throughout. One of the biggest proxies in a capitalistic economy, where are they paying the most salary? It's a very inexpensive way to tell, and the greedy here do better, because where are they paying the most is a fundamental supply-demand curve. So supply is relatively less, demand is high, therefore you're getting paid a lot. But this also means something deeper. I've switched jobs, I've switched roles from time to time, and there's a reason I've had to switch.
Pretty interesting idea of how did you know, and so probably served you pretty well throughout your life. How did you kind of get that instinct? How do you hone that?
I think the big thing is, for success, often you have to be an amazing quitter of something. And it sounds counterintuitive. If you're working extremely hard and not getting anywhere, working harder still may not be the answer. It may be that something else is where the answer lies. And a very simple proxy for that, proxy for supply and demand, is the pay. Fundamentally, we are auctioning our skills. Employers are bidding on it, and hopefully there are a lot more bidders than sellers. Yes. So that's how we get paid. And that's the supply chain of talent. In some spaces, you will see this paying a lot more. Those are probably the right spaces to be, unless there's satisfaction beyond the money that draws you to certain other spaces that's more altruistic. This is a good way to understand where the puck is going.
And especially if you had a green card need, right? That's probably even better place.
It's an even better place.
More demand, right?
Yes, if they're offering green card in that space, so that made it a little simpler. Certain spaces, they'll be like, we don't need anyone. No need of green cards. We have more than enough people here. Okay, where they need a green card, probably then there's not enough talent. That's a good space to go into.
And I love, too, your idea of the 80%, so maybe you could go into that about you're 80% ready and they'll give you that opportunity.
Thank you. Excellent pointer. So where the industry is growing as a whole, it's at the beginning of a hockey stick. You don't have to be 100% ready. The space is growing so massively. You're 80% ready, and they turn to you and go, Brett, I don't have a leader. Tomorrow 20 people show up. You've got to do your best. And guess what? You won't be the best leader on day 1 or week 1, but you will be pretty good on week 2 and week 3. And that's a very different trajectory of career versus you're 120% ready and your boss has to nitpick and find, okay, I wish you would talk a bit louder or say things differently. And it's not, sometimes those are problems, oftentimes those are just nitpickings because they don't have a role to offer. They don't know what to tell you, why they cannot promote you or get you to the next level. So
it's more just because the company is not there on a growth.
The company is not at a growth point. Yes, you may be deserving. The company does not have the role opening up because they're not growing. So where you see a lot of hiring going on, where you see a field which is paying a lot, is a good proxy. Where you see they're offering green cards is a good proxy for where there's demand versus where there's shrinking. And oftentimes the first derivative of a field is a better indicator than even where it is at. First derivative as in, are you seeing hiring or layoffs? Sure, it's paying a lot still. That's a good indicator of where it's going. Are the wages rising or dropping? As a student, you're coming out in the industry 3-4 years out, so you're doing a machine learning or predictive model. Where does the ball go 4 years from now? You need to go in that direction.
And basically, so no matter where you go, calculus is always involved.
Yes, calculus is always involved. First derivative, integrals and differentials, always involved, yes.
Got it. And then I guess from that perspective within Oracle, so you kind of get there, how did you establish your first role? How did you establish your first space? Because obviously coming out of college and especially coming from a different country as well,
harder, yeah.
How do you kind of establish yourself within that?
So oftentimes when you come into a space, there are two ways. One is to go beeline for the top. The other is to go a little bit more of a spiral, and you come a bit more outside in. Outside in will stand you in much better stead, as I have found it, because you simply have way more context of the whole ecosystem. You are not going to do the exact same job even in the same company 2 years from now or 3 years from now. You may find there's a slight variation and a slightly different group is the right group you want to be or which most aligns with your skill sets. So outside in for someone brand new coming to a company is often front end and applications. You pick up some context, you start with that, and you hone in, go into the core database server. So that's what I did at Oracle. So I started with UI, and front end at that time, Java was very new. It allowed me to do some fancy front ends, which was reused in Oracle applications in many different products later, mostly because it was just very new and it was cool and I was excited, it was visual. And as I picked up more context, I worked my way into more of the core and heart.
And how did you do that? Was it through networking? Was it kind of an active approach of that? Or was it kind of, as they saw your talent unfurl, they kind of gave you those opportunities to move further into the core?
Very good point. A lot of it is networking. To even apply to the right jobs or right roles, many a times it's just simply network and serendipity that you learn that there's something someone else didn't even know. So the network effects are massive, and being connected with other people who are connected. In a strange way, connectedness is a currency in the professional world.
Sure.
So you won't even know in many cases that this exists.
So in a lot of ways too, as a young professional, you would say that you almost have two jobs, right? You have to perform your day job, but then along that way, you have to cultivate that network in order to be successful.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to cultivate that network. And the third factor becomes the risk-reward ratio. And in economics, there's something called a Sharpe ratio, risk-free reward, and what is with some risk. If that ratio is steep, you will make those jumps. If that ratio is flat, you won't. And often a person who has low risk-reward ratio, or risk-free reward, will make those risky bets and go much further. So many a times you'll see that someone in the bottom quartile of the class will outperform everyone in life. Not because the average expected performance is that, but because of the risk-reward ratio, they have to take the most risks, and they often go much further than anyone else.
That's really fascinating. So in terms of that, so you've actually seen from your own experience of the kind of the backgrounds where people come from. If they come from, say, not the expected path, they will actually take on the riskier assignment because they need to push themselves and they need to get themselves in those rooms.
Exactly. So where the risk-free reward or low risk reward is not there, they have to take much riskier paths, and the trade-off is sometimes they'll shoot to the very top. That is.
Have you seen, and I know coming from, say, UNC Charlotte, there is a particular, we like to say the ability is kind of universal, but oftentimes the opportunity is not.
Mm-hmm.
And so for people who come from, say, not the, what are considered the most prestigious of the universities,
I agree.
How do they kind of stand out and kind of execute on that sharp ratio?
Excellent question. So this is funny because from UNC Charlotte, you're always competing with Harvard and Stanford and MIT. I happened to work on Corba, which is distributed computing, and IBM was at that point doing a lot of work from C++ and Pascal and Fortran and Java. How would all of this talk? And on Corba, I became more of an expert because I was doing my master's project on it, I was working at IBM on it, I was writing trader service on it, and it was on my resume. It just happened to be on my website, on my resume, and somewhat at that same time, I was thinking, what would I do? How would I get a job? Because I needed a job in a year. So I was trying to download Oracle forms and Oracle reports, trying to get a job with Oracle. I had heard that with Oracle or someone who needs to use Oracle. I'd heard from my friends that jobs around Oracle there are lots of jobs. So every night on my dial-up modem, I was downloading all of Oracle. And my roommates hated me because it took up all the bandwidth for the entire evening. And one of my roommates, his girlfriend, could never get through because night after night I was trying and it would always disconnect. And then suddenly I get a call from Oracle. So I thought this was my first.
So you're in trouble
I thought I was in trouble for downloading so many times. So I started, as soon as he said he's from Oracle, I started with, it's not my fault. Yeah, I've been trying to download. It breaks every time. I don't know what to do. I think it's at your server. That's a server problem. And then he listens to the tirade and goes, oh, you're welcome to continue downloading. I'm a manager with Oracle. I need some people who do Corba. And I found you're one of the few people in all of US who works on Corba. One of the few grad students who's working on Corba and seems to be quite deep. I was going to interview you for Corba. So that was a lot simpler because I couldn't download Oracle forms, Oracle reports. I was going to download and learn those. Now he wanted to talk to me about what I was doing already. So it was a very simple conversation.
So it goes back to your serendipity, right?
Yes.
You knew you wanted to go there, in a sense it eventually started to.
Yes. So if you see demand and uptake, I don't think I was as structured in my thinking at that time. I was a very poor student at that point. I had a car which always threatened to break down, so I never drove too far. But I was spending a lot of time with students, and I knew who was getting what job, so it did help. It helped. You have to have a pulse and instinctive feeling that this is on its way up, this is on its way down.
And you don't have to get it too right, you have to figure out the direction.
You have to figure out the direction, yes, yes. If you have a good pulse for that, you will consistently move to the things which take you up, which have the tailwinds versus the headwinds.
Sure. Yeah. And then from moving on within Oracle, after you kind of had done that, how did you know it was time for the next?
For the next move?
Yes.
That was a little simpler. I got my green card, and I got a big raise again. And this was with a company which was the market leader in application servers, BEA WebLogic. And WebLogic was purchased by Oracle eventually for $8.5 billion. So it was a huge thing. Yeah.
Very cool. In terms of that, so you kind of moved into that system there. And then how did you start to see, okay, you moved more so into, say, management and also even consumer side. So
yes.
How did that kind of start to, from a central, say, company enterprise system
to consumer?
Yeah.
So there are two things. Within BEA, the company was growing, doing very well. I started to feel I wanted to be a manager I had not had till that point, and provide one of the most important things. People figure out how if they know the why, and providing that context. One of the most inspirational stories to me is about a shoe shine boy who would shine shoes outside of JP Morgan, and looked very excited. One of the bankers asked him, "Why are you so excited? You're just shining shoes." He said, "I don't see it quite that way. Every time a banker from JP Morgan walks into any investment banking deal, even before he's opened his mouth to say the first word, everyone notices his shoe." And I do. So I believe I work on the sales, the first impression of every person, every investment banker from JP Morgan. That was a very good manager. You change the context of how they look at their lives. So I wanted to be that manager who gives that context and then helps everything else function with integrity.
And what's actually kind of interesting, you mentioned that, right? The shoeshine boy, in a sense, had first and access to those managers. So even if they were, for example, in college, if he was in college, right, just being able to interact with those people on a daily basis is an entirely different way of building a network and building connections with someone.
In the early stages of a career, money is one thing, the right leader is another thing. The right leader inculcates, in some way rubs off, will become a part of you. So finding the right leader sometimes is a bit more important than even the direct money.
How would you go about that?
How would I go about? So the right leader is not instructional, is not scared of chaos. If you look at war theory, or even how, I'm not saying emulate terrorist organizations and anything else, but in this structure of management, in command, but not in control. In command and out of control. So if a manager tries to control everything of how you do, then effectively the entire organization's brain is limited to the brains of the manager. And one person can be 2x as bright, which is very hard to be 2x as bright as a Harvard student or a Stanford student. 2x is a very high bar. Now, probably 10% and you're managing hundreds of people. So in command and out of control and being comfortable with that chaos is very important. Innovation needs chaos, some control in that chaos.
Random variable.
It's the random variable. And you leave that you unclamp and leave that chaos open during the phases of innovation. And when you've hit, that's the beginning of the hockey stick. And then you tighten and tighten and tighten. And when you've hit a point where you're not sure that if you jitter the system, even you can make it better, tighten the clamp down on the system. So it's very different between the beginning of the hockey stick and much later. It's a massive business, how the process is. And the manager being comfortable with some chaos, not being over-enforcing is very critical.
And in some senses, it's like a distributed team, right? So the idea is that in these complex systems we live in today you can't create all these rules every single second of the day. You really have to be able to create a framework that within that, a team that comes from like General McChrystal's theory, right? The team of teams theory, that those teams have to be able to operate almost autonomously because they have a much better idea of what's on the network on the ground and the information they're getting. And by the time you get it, it's probably either too late or it's been changed in some way.
Absolutely. Very well put. So the top leadership should not be making decisions. If they're making decisions, they're doing the wrong thing. They should be making the frameworks for the decisions and really sweat the details on the framework for the decision, because the decisions are happening way lower down in the org. Every first-line engineer knows exactly what the company needs, and they will run far faster. That's how switching theory works, for instance. The switches on the control plane and the data plane are completely decoupled. The control plane gives some policy. The data plane is fast, moving fast, very different velocity.
Do you find that, because what we've seen a lot is that within the university ecosystem, there's much more taught based around structure and answers, and in a sense you're saying almost the exact opposite. So how, while you are a student, do you start to develop those skill sets so that you can come in? I mean, you wouldn't be a manager right away, but that you are kind of preparing yourself.
Preparing yourself. One of the best ways I find to go about solving problems, if you're given a difficult problem, if I ask you to make it 2x as good as status quo, you will try to band-aid, find a bunch of band-aids. If you make it 2.5x, you will still band-aid. If you make it 3x, you will try to band-aid, it won't quite work. But if you make it 10x, suddenly people don't think about band-aiding. They think dramatically different. And I happen to read a lot of war theory. In warfare, if I'm slightly stronger than you, 90+% of the times I will win. You will lose, because that's the natural order. If you're dramatically weaker than me, say 2 to 3x weaker, 66% of the times you will win, which is a stunning conclusion, right? You're a lot weaker. The fundamental thing that changes is that you are not even trying to play by the same rules. You will create a new set of rules, and I'm extremely predictable because I've got such an overwhelming advantage. I'm a sitting duck because I'm extremely predictable. And think of that in real world. If you want massive innovation, try to make it 10x. And you're completely rethinking how you would go about it.
So it's almost, even with entrepreneurship, right? That's why entrepreneurship beats out the larger
firms. Yes. So at all points, if you try to think, how can I do 10x internally in a larger firm? You may be able to find it before some other entrepreneur, but yes, that's the weakness. That's the fundamental weakness. Your path is predictable. Someone else is thinking dramatically different and looking for new tools. And oftentimes it's a new thing that came out in the market, like machine learning got easier with TensorFlow, or flash SSDs became more available. These are fundamental shifts. Or it's more multi-core machines. So,
and the older companies not necessarily thinking
everything.
How do you? How else have you found yourself to developing yourself as a leader? What were some of those key characteristics that you tried to cultivate in yourself as you grew?
I think what you're scared of is very important. What is your biggest concern? A lot of leaders, the weaker leaders, the top fear they have is that someone in their org won't listen to them. That is not at all my fear. Every incentive is lined up so they listen to what I say. My top fear is that everyone will listen to me and I will have led them wrong. I will have led them to the incorrect places, and then there's a consequence, and they look back at me and say, Ashok, we followed you. So when you have that fear, you're just a lot more open and less guarded. You are different in your approach. You explain your approach to everyone, and you're constantly revalidating it. So the agile of management is revalidating your hypothesis. We are all blind, and we are all wearing some lenses. I grew up from engineering, so I think I have some biases which are more pro-engineering. You have to be aware of your biases. You have to surround yourself with things that are complementary. You don't have to be good at everything. The combination has to be good at everything. Think Chicago Bulls. Dennis Rodman is a deeply flawed man, but without him, Jordan and Pippen would get fouled a lot more. He drew the fouls.
He was the bruiser.
Yes, he drew all the fouls to himself, and suddenly it's dramatically different. So, as a leader, one more thing, which when you're hiring, certain leaders hire to eliminate weakness. Certain leaders hire for spikes of strength. The latter is a simpler hiring model, but leads to more mediocre teams. The former, where you're hiring to eliminate weakness. Where you're hiring for the spikes of strength, it's different. You are hiring people with certain flaws, but the complementary skill sets of the team are dramatically different.
How do you evaluate spikes versus making sure you don't get drawn in the trap of weakness?
Excellent. So spikes you often cannot evaluate. One of the examples of spikes. If a person's worked for 2 years on something, I may not be the expert on that. It's very hard for me to interview them on that. But they will be able to explain everything. And they will have gone deep in that domain. And they'll act as an excellent teacher, and what they say will be internally consistent. And if I Google out later, it will be externally consistent. I will have learned a lot from that interview. If they've never gone deep in what they did 2 years or 4 years, they will not go deep into whatever they do the next 2 years or 4 years. So that is a very good indicator. What are they passionate about? How deeply have they assimilated and structured their thoughts? Sometimes it's not a bad thing to make a mistake. It's a bad thing not to be aware of the mistakes you make, because you will repeat them. And if you've repeated the previous mistakes, you're going to repeat new mistakes you make recurrently. You simply don't introspect. So that's what I look for.
I thought one thing that was actually really interesting, I saw a quote from you about how managers, in a sense, are driving through the rearview mirror, and the only thing they have is the past data, but you're in a sense driving $1 billion car, and you're not actually looking at the road ahead.
Yes.
That's kind of the big block of a manager, right? Is you're looking at past
Looking
data
back.
to predict the future.
Yes. So as you go higher up in management, one of the things, the world becomes a little less certain. You're playing in murkier territory. When you're a CEO, you play in even murkier territory. You're guiding a team. You have to keep some confidence, some degree of confidence, and constantly revalidating. It's more convergent. It's more divergent as you go higher up in the org chart. You have to be very, very data-driven and constantly re-examining your hypotheses. And also the feeling that the previous playbook will work again doesn't quite hold. Even in the same company 3 years from now, it's dramatically different, not because the company is different, the entire ecosystem, the world is different. So the previous playbooks don't quite apply. Constantly re-examining is extremely important.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Ashok, it was great talking to you today, and thank you for this stimulating conversation, and we look forward to continuing it again.
Thank you so much, Brett. Look forward. It's exciting. I believe in the students and that you are the future, and look forward to more conversations.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.